Hello and welcome. I'm Paterno Makel and this is Rappler Talk. The South China Sea issue is heating up again, and we're lucky to have with us today one of the 5 judges of the Philippines case against China, Judge Stanislaw Pawlak. Thank you for joining us, Judge Pawlak, and I hope you're having a nice time here in Manila.
I had very nice time here. I'm very grateful for being invited here, because my first trip to Manila and first trip to Philippines. But we used to sit together in the United Nations General Assembly, side by side. So always we discuss with our Filipino colleagues there about the Philippines, about relations with Poland. So I learned about a lot of things from General Romulo.
Oh, really?
Yes, some years back.
So you said a while ago that you've been with the Foreign Ministry of Poland since 1955. Fast forward to 2013, you learned that you will be handling the Philippines case against China over the South China Sea. How did you feel when you learned that you would be one of the judges?
A little bit surprised, because we have 21 judges, and the president of the tribunal then was Judge Yanai from Japan. And he asked me, you are from Poland, from the former socialist country, so you know the law of the bloc, socialist bloc. And also you've been in Asia and engaged in Asian affairs for many years. I served first in Korea, in International Supervisory Commission in Panmunjom, and then I served for 5 years in Japan. I served in Vietnam, also in the International Control Commission during the war in 1960s, early 60s. And then I wrote a lot about this area. I wrote a book about legal status of Okinawa. I wrote 2 books on American policy towards China for almost 40 years' time, for 1940s till late 1970s. So they thought that I am the best candidate to join the tribunal, and I started to prepare myself. I didn't know much about this dispute. I know geography, I know the area. I worked in Asia more than 10 years.
How hard did you prepare for the case?
For the case, I studied your application first. And then I went through the legal papers of similar cases. And there are not too many of these cases, because here we have question of explanation, have question of application of UNCLOS, because every state which is party to the Convention of Law of the Sea is entitled to some benefits from that. There's 168 states parties to the Convention of 1982, Montego Bay Convention, and each party is equal. So big or small has the same privileges and same duties to respect others. So every country has a duty to respect the rights which were given by the Convention. And Convention is very strict on the zones which the states are entitled to. The land is governing the sea. You have access to land, you have a land with access to sea, and every party has same privileges.
Would you remember how many books you read about this topic? How long you studied in your room?
No, I think the whole case lasted from January 2013 to July 2016, so it's more than 3 years. And first few months we had a little knowledge about this. When the application came from the Philippines, I started to study. I started geography, I started history, I started to look into the legal problems you have here. And then we were not fully well informed, because there was no respondents from China. The only papers were coming from the Philippines. And later, after the first decision was taken, China presented in December 2014, the position paper on on the question of kind of presentation of Chinese position. And from this point of view, we learned Chinese position too. So we were in the tribunal, we decided first that we have to treat both states the same way.
What was your first impression of the case? Was it easy for you or was it hard?
It was difficult for me, but I know Asia from my own personal experience.
Why was it difficult for you?
I have many friends here. I wrote, as I mentioned, I wrote a few books about Asian affairs. So it was not a surprise to me to learn more about this. I was not much involved in the legal problems between the Asian countries. But there are a few disputes here. There's a dispute in Himalaya between India and China. There were disputes between Russia and China. And there were some unsolved problems of the Korean Peninsula. So I know the problems, but I was a little bit surprised that between you and China, there are not all problems solved, and especially question of entitlements to the sea, the South China Sea, and the 6 countries or 7 countries around the South China Sea have their own interests, but those interests could be materialized only on legal grounds, and those legal grounds is UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and this ground is the same for every country. You cannot get more. You cannot go less, but you cannot go more about that. So every country can get territorial waters, adjacent waters, exclusive economic zone, and you can get continental shelf, and nothing more. The other part is high seas, where there's common heritage of mankind. Every state has same rights there. There's no privilege for anyone to have more on high seas than others.
You fast forward to 2016, you released the ruling on the case, I think in July 2016. How did you feel about this decision, this unanimous decision by the arbitral tribunal? I mean, after 3 years of painstakingly studying and deciding, as a judge, personally, how did you feel that you were releasing this decision to the rest of the world?
It was not easy, because not everything, not all information are very clear. We didn't know, for example, what kind of land features we have here in the South China Sea. So we asked experts who came to us, and it was geographical experts from Australia.
They helped you?
Yes, to gather information. And then we studied imagery from satellites. We studied also history, back to 17th, 18th century. We went through our people from the registry, got for us material of those who were coming here and discovered this area.
Was this the hardest case that you've had to handle in your whole career?
Here with this case or other cases?
Other cases, compared to other cases on the law of the sea.
There was one of the very difficult cases between India and Bangladesh. There was delimitation of sea border. So we had to look into the situation there, practically. And another one might be even more difficult between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Between Bangladesh and Myanmar, also the delimitation of sea border. But it was, for us, the whole tribunal of 21 judges.
Yeah.
But this type of tribunal, which we were invited, there were only 5 judges.
5 judges,
so
all in your hands.
So we had to study this and look into this with having access to the available sources. And those available sources were coming back to 200 years, because we would like to see maps. We would like to see how those sailormen, military navy people, were looking at Ituaba, were looking to the Spratly Islands, how they described it, because we have to stick to the convention. Convention is measuring the rocks and the islands according to natural condition, not the condition which is now modified.
So on the basis of you being just 5 in the arbitral tribunal...
Only after we are satisfied that this piece of land which is in the water is above the water in high tide or below the water in the high tide. For this we had to look into calendar too, but when water is high or water is low.
So it was very challenging because it was all aspects for you.
This is one of the most difficult questions. Another question was historic rights. Historic rights. And convention is United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is not, I would say, kind of a document which is describing everything. Mm-hmm. And but it is true that the convention is exhausting this kind of a Bible for the sea. Mm-hmm. And that's something which is outside the convention is not a law. So the so-called historic rights were extinguished as far as they are not covering the areas which are in the convention. And convention is entitling all parties to the convention to some zones. Why the historic rights are not zones? You have a kind of, you have a claim, but once you join the convention, you have to follow the convention principles. You cannot imagine that you are entitled to more.
Yeah.
You have to you are entitled what convention is granting you, because you have to respect the rights of other parties to the convention.
Why is this case important?
What is?
The Philippines and China case. Why is this important for the law of the sea?
It's a pilot case. There's no other verdict of this type. There are some examples or some jurisprudence in some Latin American areas, especially Caribbean areas, but only limited, not this type. There are some cases in South Arabian countries too, of the islands there, but nothing like this. That's why a kind of I think it's milestone achievement, and it's kind of guiding achievement for the others to follow, because we didn't decide about sovereignty. We had no right to do this. We didn't decide about the borders, sea borders between the states. We decided only to explain what is convention meaning, what is meaning Article 121, islands or rocks. We had to decide that. This is kind of definition. We have to decide that historic rights were extinguished after convention when it came into force.
So there was no other ruling that decided those things?
It is limited ruling on meaning of the convention, explaining the convention to others. So this gives the material for negotiations. And this is kind of giving people knowledge about what it means 121. Is it rock? A rock which is not entitled, not capable to keep stable group of people living there on their own without big or I would say supply to them all the time, or the island or the rock which is giving you a possibility to have kind of economic activity. There were some examples. We studied that in 1920s and 1930s. Japanese companies were taking the fertilizer from there, the guano, for some years. And they worked hard there. The people were staying some time. But they abandoned this because it was not economical. It was too expensive. And the products were not as good as they expected. And that's why we, studying history, we found out that this land could be used, or land features could be used temporarily for short staying there, when there's a typhoon coming, or to have a rest, or to change the ship or something, but not for permanent living there, like in some other islands on Pacific. And that's why this rocks or this small piece of land was abandoned. We used from time to time, not all the time.
But Judge Pawlak, many people in the Philippines say that the ruling was useless because there is no international police that can enforce the ruling. As a judge, how would you respond to these kinds of feedback?
No, I respond the same way as you can respond to international law. International law is different from internal law.
Because in internal law, there would be policemen to enforce it, and
gendarme, police, you have army, you have rockets.
Yeah, you can jail your opponent.
Yes, but international law is based mostly on reciprocity.
What does that mean?
It means that if you are doing something wrong, you will be not accepted. But if you are doing good thing, the other party should do the same. And if you are hostile to the other country, that country expected will be hostile to you. And this reciprocity question is important. Let's say diplomatic situation. You have a diplomat in your country and in my country. If we treat your diplomat badly, you have recourse to me to treat my diplomats badly. So this reciprocity goes. This is one principle. Another principle is good faith. And if you have an agreement, if one party sign and ratify the agreement, you expect that the party will fulfill the agreement. If you have UNCLOS, United Nations Convention of the Sea, on the law of the sea, and all partners accepted the same rules, and we expect that the party will follow the rules. There's no privileged country. There's no privileged state. Each party to the United Nations Convention on the law of the sea has same rights and same obligations. And that's why this is reciprocity. This is a balance of interest. Once you sign this, you negotiated this, you signed it, you ratified it, you have to fulfill it. There's no other way. So I mentioned in my intervention today about cases where you have people who study this issue. Many states don't comply with the verdicts and awards of the tribunals. And some are fulfilling step by step, and some are full, but they are protecting their prestige. So they don't admit that they do it, but they do it. As I mentioned, Russia, it was mentioned by someone. with this case between Netherlands and Russia about this Greenpeace ship there. They arrested ship, Russians, arrested the crew, arrested the Greenpeace people. They didn't recognize the award, but step by step they released ship, they released the arrested people and crew. So in a matter of fact, they didn't accept this, but they accepted the merits of the situation. Of course, this is a question of general international law. General international law, as you mentioned rightly, has no police, has no prison, has no pressure, but it's kind of long-term interest. I think it's better to have, for one country with another country, friends than enemies. Because this is reciprocity. If you will be unfriendly to me, I'll be paying the same. I'll be unfriendly to you. And for the long run, I think the economic interest, security interest will prevail. And there's a Corfu case, 70 years, no more, 85 years old. And finally, Albania recognized these payments which they have to cover for Great Britain.
What do you mean when you say that in the long run, economic interests will prevail?
Economic interests will prevail and security interests will prevail.
What do you mean?
I mean that you expect that instead of having enemy and to defend yourself, you have a friend who will not attack you. And
will give you money.
Yes, I will give you money, and you can earn money for this. You can export your products. You can import cheaper products. You have exchange of personnel. You have exchange of money. You can invest. So, for the long run, I think it would be unwise to say to use the military power or to use threats instead of goodwill and cooperation. But I think the most important is good faith. Because once you sign an agreement like UNCLOS, all parties should fulfill the obligations which are there and be entitled not only to have a good document, but to have your interests protected. And you cannot expect that the other parties in this convention have more privileges than you have. Otherwise, everybody will be not equal.
Yeah, but China is more powerful militarily and economically, and they can always say that, you know, we are richer than you, so you have that ruling, but we have the money, we have the arms.
This is a question of big power policy. So this is a subjective approach to this. I understand and I respect Chinese interests. I admire this country for this culture, for the productivity and position in the world, but also expect that China will be dealing with the neighbors, and not only neighbors, based on the law, not on their own interests only.
Because
they are equal to others. And I think this equality will be the basis for cooperation. Otherwise, in the United Nations, every small country, being the United States, China, or Russia, or Palau, or Malta, have the one voice and one vote. Security Council has more responsibility. Members of the permanent members has more responsibility. But otherwise, every state is equal. And once you have an agreement, you expect that your partner will do the same that you have. As a matter of fact, China got much from the UNCLOS because the UNCLOS granted China, like to other countries, these zones, territorial water, adjacent waters, continental shelf, and the economic free zone. So if China got it, it's about, I don't know, about 40% or more of this 9-dash line area, but no more.
So what can a 500-page ruling do against a powerful country like China?
You cannot compare this because paper is paper, but the contents of the paper is important.
So what can the contents of this paper do against a powerful country like China?
I think it's people in China, like we or like people in Europe and America, they have to stick to the principles of international law. Those principles are simple. Every state is equal. And every state has equal rights. There are no privileged states anymore. There are 5 superpowers or 5 permanent members of Security Council. They have additional obligations. They are responsible for peace and security of mankind, the whole world. But they have no other privileges. Of course, from political point of view, the big powers try to influence others because of the military might, economic might, population might. But this is only question of their own vision of themselves. But in law, everybody is equal, like in say, internal system. There are no citizens which are having more privileges than others. In one state, they have the same privileges, same obligations. And also, I think it's in interest also for China to be accepted as a good neighbor, and also to have good trade with neighbors. And it's, of course, better to use resources not to arm themselves, but to modernize itself, to develop itself, to have more trade with neighbors than to have more guns against neighbors. And I think the might is a fact of life, but wisdom should prevail over the short-run interests. The wisdom is to have better friends, otherwise you have a law of jungle. So this is something which I cannot accept, no. And the world has to be say, governed by the principles which we invented international law, not for having a good written codes, but for the basis for cooperation, not for fighting. And I think everybody has to forget about own interests only, but to look what the other neighbors, friends have to expect from us.
Is there a danger for a country that does not follow international law to become considered an international outlaw or outcast?
Of course, one has to be very careful about expectations. It's better to know before what is going to happen. But I think from the long run, if you look into the world of today, there was no, say, world war anymore. For 400 years, you had 2 big wars. I survived the Second World War, and it was not easy. I still remember that we had to run to avoid bombings. We had to run to avoid to be killed by attacking forces. I don't like to repeat it anymore. I chose this profession to be a diplomat for more than 50 years. I served in 7 countries or 6 countries. I was four-time ambassador. I negotiated a lot of treaties, and now I work for second term in the tribunal, because I think the only way is not to use arms, but to use persuasion, to help each other, to cooperate with each other. This is the way to develop humanity, to develop the world. If I compare the world after the Second World War with today, there's completely different kind of society, different kind of level of life, and different perspectives. We have to travel now to the cosmos to find colonies there. But we have to, first of all, to make order in our own globe.
I find that point very interesting, because our President Duterte, keeps on saying that if we assert the ruling, we would be courting war with China. And you're saying the opposite. If we uphold international law, we would be avoiding war.
No, international law is not against anyone. International law is for everyone. You cannot say that the rules which you expect, you cannot select international law. You have to accept it all. You can say, this is good for me, so I accept it. This is wrong for me, I don't accept it. You have to have, but one time this law is against you, but next time is in your favor. So you have to balance this. And also international is created by China too, and practice too. We have to expect this practice. Mm-hmm. But we cannot, no one has to be very careful to act, not to break international law.
Mm-hmm. A while ago you talked about the best way forward after the ruling was issued, and you mentioned negotiations as the best way forward. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes, I think what I've said, because I was looking for some ways how to handle this case afterwards. I think there are two ways. One is persuasion, and show that we don't ask anything more, but only what is granted to us by the convention. And we expect that you, as a party to that convention, do the same. Mm-hmm. So this is how you can solve this without negotiations. Mm-hmm. You have to talk. Mm-hmm. Talk without preconditions. The only precondition is both you and I accept the rulings of international law. And our verdict, our award, is giving only a little more precise instruments to negotiate.
You talk a lot about preconditions. Can you give us example of preconditions that are commonly laid out in cases like this, in negotiations? Like what preconditions could endanger a ruling like the Hague ruling on the South China Sea?
Precondition would be, for example, we will start to negotiate if you recognize historic rights of ours. You recognize that we have a large part of South China Sea because we were there 2,000 years ago. This is precondition. You can come to the conference table and say, okay, this is a question that we have to make sea border because we have been entitled by the convention to have access 200 miles from our baseline towards the sea, and you have the same, and look how far we can go. We can overlap, or we are not having access to each other. So let's make a sea border. Don't talk about any preconditions. Use convention first. What convention is allow us to do. you come to me and say, contention gives you 12 miles plus 12 miles of additional strip of water, and then you have 200 miles on baseline. And then you have the same, how far we are from each other. If you are more far, this water is not belonging neither to you nor to us. So this is negotiation.
No preconditions.
No, I negotiated with Germany and with Russia about the limitation of our side borders, because they have access to Baltics. And in 1985, with Russia, I negotiated only 2 days, because we prolonged this division of the territorial waters straight. We didn't make any changes.
But negotiations with preconditions, I think that's what's ideal. But in the real world...
I will give you one example. With the former GDR, German Democratic Republic, I negotiated five years. Because East Germany, communist East Germany, in the Bay of Pomerania, they had enlarged their territorial water from 3 miles to 12 miles. But this bay was not very wide, so this 12 miles covered access to our ports. And this bay was not this one, so you can, if you enlarge this, they control movement of our ships and foreign ships to our ports, because they have to go through their territorial waters. And Baltic is a shallow sea, so we have to build channels to allow bigger ships to go to our ports, 2 of our ports. So we propose them, you withdraw from this area, because you are entitled to 12 miles, but we are entitled to access to the sea. How we can go with this? So they had the same problem with Denmark. So they negotiated and they withdrew 12 miles to allow Danish ships to go to their ports on the high seas, not territorial waters. And there is some situation similar between Belgium and the Netherlands. To Rotterdam, they had to go through the Belgian waters. So they negotiated and they allowed them to go through this. So finally, after 5 years of negotiations, they withdraw themselves. This corridor, which is going to our ports, is now under our jurisdiction.
Yeah, but in other negotiations, there are always the stronger countries and the weaker countries. And in the case of the Philippines and China, China is always stronger economically speaking and militarily speaking. So I mean, you're pushing for negotiations on equal terms, but how can we be equal if China is richer and we are
This is fact of life.
Yeah.
You cannot change this.
Yeah.
But if you are tall and I am short, so it doesn't mean that we are not equal. So it's the same with the countries. So this is not a question of how big you are, how strong you are. It's a question that you have the same rights as I have. In your country and mine, I have one vote to vote for my president. And if you have relations with bigger country, the big country has the same one vote in the United Nations.
And what role would the ruling play in negotiations with China?
I think it's a clarification of 2 important provisions of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. First is question that the historic rights were extinguished as long as you are a member of the club in the state which is party to the United Convention.
Mm-hmm.
So every member of this convention, party to a convention, has the same rights. This is no other thing. And if they have the same rights, this is question of decision that you have to forget about your expectations. You join the club, you have the same rules. Mm-hmm. There is no other way. And this is second important decision is what is rock, what is island. Island is defined by Article 121. Is an elevated land in the sea which could sustain human beings or economic life by its own. Rocks are not. Rocks could be two types of rocks. Rocks which under high tide are above the water or below the water. Mm-hmm. And those which are above the water and they cannot sustain life, human beings living there for good, as a colony working there, mm-hmm. or economic life, they have only 12 nautical miles. Mm-hmm. Those who are underwater belong either to the high seas or to continental shelf of the country which has covered the water by their economic free zone, not to others. Because if you have this, you mix apples with strawberries, you know. It's something different.
So it's these two things that we can bring into negotiations with China?
Yes, well, you can.
The clarified rights.
Yes, so there is question of preconditions. Now, so we can sit down to discuss. Here you have the same book as I have. You have the International Convention, which is allowing us to have 200 nautical miles of economic zone. And you have the same. Don't come to our economic zone.
A follow-up question would be, if we would end up negotiating with China, why did we need to file a case? Why was this
important? I mentioned in my intervention that for many years you negotiated with China, but always you negotiated not, I don't know the details because I was not party to the negotiations, but I understand that you negotiated not having a strong legal basis. You didn't use convention probably, or you used conventions a little bit superficially. What we did, we make something more precise, that every country, every state member of the club, namely the party to the convention, has the same rights. The Philippines is entitled to have 200 miles from the baseline. Mm-hmm. And whatever is done should be with agreement with Philippines. Being Vietnam, being Malaysia, being China, being Japan, if Japan is far away, but if there would be. Mm-hmm. Other things are not negotiable. Mm-hmm. It happens sometimes that people allow states allow other states to have bases in their territories. There's something like that. There are some situations, like between some South American countries, which don't have access to the sea. They negotiated to have a free way to go to. With Chile, for example, Argentina and Chile have negotiations that they allow to use their territory by others, but it means that this territory is still their territory. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the same, if you decide this is, I haven't thought about that yet, but I think if you decide to give some concessions to China in your economic free zone, this is possible. This is possible. This is negotiations. If you decided that in your economic free zone you can, together with China, exploit or explore first and then exploit mineral resources, oil resources, gas resources together in your zone, this is your, I think, sovereign decision. This is the way you can go.
But it is the Philippines call, the call of the Philippines.
But this doesn't mean that you give them your territory or your right. This is still your economic zone. But you work together with China or United States or European Union or Poland, doesn't matter, on the international corporation which is looking for mineral resources in your economic zone, but it's your economic zone, not others. It could be Chinese economic zone, the same.
But of course, there's also the question of domestic law, because
yes, domestic law is then governing that.
There are quarters saying that domestic law prohibits joint exploration in Philippine waters.
No, this detail I don't know much about. I have to study that.
So we have to harmonize the international law and
you have to harmonize with the
domestic law.
Yes, but what I was asked during the panel discussion, I think there is no contradiction between exploration, exploitation, and sovereign decisions, because you are entitled to have 200 miles from your border, from your baseline. And if the company would like to ask you to drill there, you have to give your permission upon your own interest. You are maybe not interested to do that.
Is it right?
Nobody can force you to do it. This is your sovereign decision. But you have to expect that the other side will do the same in their territory, their economic zone.
Is it right to say that the Hague ruling makes the Philippines stronger in negotiations with China?
Yes, it gives you arguments, new arguments, but you are entitled to economic zone, and please respect that. And there is no any other law which can change this, because you agreed, China agreed to allow other states have 200 miles of economic zone. And how they can deprive Philippines to have the same right. And this is way of negotiations. I think maybe not only question of the forward negotiation about the sea line, but also border lines with I don't know, here you have Malaysia, you have these areas which could be taken into consideration. But first of all, to negotiate the division of the sea area.
It's interesting that you said it gives us new arguments, just arguments. It doesn't give us new powers.
It gives you arguments which could be exchanged to powers, because this argument is so strong that cannot be discussed with that. You cannot say that this is not right. If you are having explanation that the rock is underwater because it was examined by the hydrographers, it was photographed by the satellites, and you cannot say that this is an island. This is not an island, it is a rock. And others cannot say nothing more, because this is scientific evidence. And we have done that. We ask the people who have a knowledge in that. If you say this is coral reefs, and if you build on that reef a cement structure, you destroy the reefs.
Mm-hmm. My last question, as a person that who lived through World War II, who practiced international law for decades, what gives you hope, especially after having ruled on this case of the Philippines and China?
I don't like to sound like a prophet because this has nothing to do with the profession. But I think that the wisdom will prevail. Otherwise, what is opposite? The lasting hostility, deciding that we surrender. What is the opposition? What you can get more for that? People say trade, investments, but it will not change your title. You are entitled to 100 miles, and you have to execute that. And this is confirmed by this verdict. This verdict was not solving anything special. It was explaining, giving you arguments to negotiate on the basis of better knowledge what the convention is meaning. And without this explanation, it would be more difficult to negotiate. And we make these negotiations easier. This is my position. I even as a person, I haven't consulted my colleagues, but this is my position. We were divided also during discussions about positions, but we have to decide on the realities.
You talk a lot about the need for wisdom. Why does wisdom matter in a world where money and power seem to rule?
I like history, so I looking into historical examples. After Second World War, in the Great Britain, United Kingdom, never was a sunset. And people were living in colonies. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, same in Indonesia with Netherlands, same in Indochina with France. And there was wisdom. The people wanted to self-determinate themselves. They wanted to have their own state, own language, own constitution, not to look to London, not to look to Paris, not to look to The Hague. So this wisdom prevailed. Of course, wisdom with the demands of people, with support of the people. And for avoiding the situation as we had after the Second World War or before, the people created United Nations Charter, not to have repeated another war for territorial gains, like Germany did, like Japan did. Why? Because this is not the way for the humanity. The most important thing is human life, and to give conditions to live and allow to live others. Why to have colonies? That's why wisdom prevailed. And now I have rivalization, the competition of big powers to have influence on others, and to repeat the economic colonization again, and then withdraw from this because there was a pressure against. So this is not wisdom. The wisdom is to find a way of cooperation, and not to have interests prevail over the law.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, Judge Pawlak.
It's a pleasure to have been here in Philippines. I wish to your country success. It would be not easy, but in long run, the wisdom will prevail.
Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Judge Stanislaw Pawlak. I'm Paterno Makel. Thank you for joining us.